Welcome, class. I want to be careful to point out earlier in this video that I'm doing these videos and I set this class up like this because I think it's very important for us to understand how we got to where we are as a country. As a public administrator, it's my responsibility to prepare you to deal with these issues such as social equity, and we're going to go in depth into that the next few weeks. But it's very important that I give you a good background, or I help you understand that we didn't get here by mistake. There were things put in place that forced us to get here. This country allowed race, our forefathers allowed race to infiltrate our government before this country was ever a country. And we allowed racism to really hurt us as a country, and we allowed slavery. And so we did various videos. In the previous video, I actually showed you all the impact of slavery on America, and I used the Mississippi secession letter, and I showed you a state that was hurting. Mississippi was angry. Mississippi said, you all have to understand, if you get rid of slavery, if you abolish slavery, you're going to hurt our way of life. It's equivalent to us telling, it's equivalent to going to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and telling them, you know what, we're going to outlaw computers. These computers and these electronic devices that we have become accustomed to in this world, we feel that these devices have really hurt us, way more than they've helped us. I mean, just recently, Target, they used computers to go in and ruin the lives of so many people because they, took their money, they ruined their identities, their credit, and what have you. These cell phones, they were meant to help us, but now people are taking pictures and they're posting them on these social networks, and they're taking unwanted pictures, and they're ruining the lives of people. So these computers, these electronic devices that you've used to make so much money, we're going to just outlaw them. As of January 1st, 2015, we're going to outlaw computers. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, whoever the big guys are in the computer industry, we're outlawing them. And if you're caught with computers, at that point, we're going to, it's going to be illegal. Can you imagine these billionaires who their whole lives are built around the computer industry and the electronic industry? Can you imagine going to them and telling them, at this point, as of this day, no more computers? Right. Just imagine telling America no more computers. Well, that's how Mississippi felt. That's how Kentucky felt, and Virginia, and South Carolina, and Alabama. They were upset. They didn't understand how their lives were built around. Mississippi was the richest state in the country. The economy in Mississippi was more powerful. Well, they had a greater economy than most other countries at that time, because of the institution of slavery. So to go to them and tell them, Mississippi, we're going to outlaw slavery, this was a blow at their civilization. You're telling these millionaires, multimillionaires, plantation owners, that we're going to take your money. We're going to take you from being a multimillionaire to being on welfare. Getting rid of slavery took Mississippi from being a multimillionaire, the richest state, one of the richest states in the nation, an economy that was larger than most countries, to being a welfare state. And they were angry. The people in Mississippi were angry. That's why the backlash following the Civil War. When they saw an African American, when they saw a black person, their lives were useless. That's why, if you remember from the previous lecture, I told you a slave was more valuable than a free black. You didn't have the Klan during slavery because you didn't want to mess with the economy. But once those blacks were free, they were a representation of you, America, stripping me of all of my wealth overnight. And so they wrote the letter of secession, and they said, for far less cause than these, our forefathers broke away from Great Britain. They said, if you get rid of slavery, you're going to get rid of our civilization. This is our livelihood. This is us. That they were upset. So I want you to understand, as public administrators, the reason I'm doing these videos is because I want you to understand these videos, and this understand is good. You have to understand what they were, where they're coming from. So when you see race tension, you understand this is why they felt like this. This is why they wrote the letter of secession. You can also want you to understand this is why blacks feel they didn't, that this country's never been fair to them. So I'm doing this to give you both sides of the of the coin, so you'll understand as an administrator how to deal with people, understanding the history of why they feel the way they feel. So we went through the Revolutionary War. We went to the post-war. We went to the Civil War, and the Civil War. Real quick, a few things happened with the Civil War that are very important for us. The first and probably the most important thing that I really want to talk about with the Civil War is that the South was not supposed to lose the Civil War for a number of reasons, but for one key reason. First of all, they were fighting at home. The Civil War was fought in the South. When you're fighting at home, you have such a big advantage, especially during that time period before we had all the technology we have today. But you had such a big advantage. So the fact that they were coming down here to fight me on my property, I know these woods. I'm a hunter. I'm a Mississippi hunter. I know these woods better than anybody else. I know what the rivers and the valleys and the mountains in the South. I know these things better than anyone else. So if you're going to fight me in the South, I have the home field advantage. Not only that, I'm fighting for a cause that I really believe in. I really believe in this thing, and it's for this reason I've decided to separate. I'm speaking on behalf of the South here. I've decided to separate from the Union. So I'm fighting for passion. I'm fighting for a cause. But a few things happened that allowed the Union to defeat the Confederate Army. And some of them include things like they went in and burnt down all the major cities. They burnt down Jackson and burnt down these major cities. They went through just burning down the cities. They went in and messed up the infrastructure. They would go into the railroads, and as opposed to simply bending the railroad, they would get a blowtorch, and they would get two guys on each side of the piece of steel, and they would put the blowtorch in the center of the steel, and they would twist the steel and bend it on the railroad tracks. Why is it important to twist it and bend it? Well, I'll tell you why. It's important to twist it and bend it because if you just simply put a blowtorch on the steel, the railroad, and you bend it, you can put a blowtorch on it and unbend it. But if you twist it and bend it, if you put a blowtorch on it, you can't get it back right. So the infrastructure of the South, they did things like that to really ruin the infrastructure of the South. And finally, when they came in and realized that the way we're gonna, the Union decided to defeat the Confederate by taking over the port cities. And that's why the Battle of Vicksburg in Vicksburg, Mississippi was such an important battle to the Civil War. But eventually, of course, we know history. The Confederates lost. But it's important to understand, although they lost, they were still unlike any war I've ever heard of in my life. Although they lost the Civil War, the Confederates, the people who were, who were survivors of the Civil War, they still held on to those values and those beliefs because they were so passionate about those values and beliefs. So following the Civil War, we went through a period called Reconstruction. And if you remember from the Mississippi Letter of Secession, Well, I'll come back to that in just a second. I'm sorry, but let me talk about something else during the Civil War that I didn't get to discuss. Of course, we know the South decided to secede from the Union. So at this point, they're not considered states. So once the North Star once the North Star realizing that they were really, for the most part, going to win the war, they broke the South up into military districts. In one particular district, given by General Sherman, he went and spoke with a group of African American slaves, former slaves, and he said, "No, now that we're about to win this war, what do you all want?" And those slaves told him, "Give us our freedom, protect our freedom, and then leave us alone." And so he did. He said, "Well, if that's what you all want, not only that, I'll also give you all." And this was his right as the general. He had the right to do this. He said, "I'll give you all the old war mules, and I'll give you all the land on the Sea Island, that goes through Georgia and Florida and South Carolina. I'll give you all this land, and I'll divide it up amongst you all, and I'll give the people in my under my command, I'll give you all 40 acres each and the mule, so you all can start your new life." And this is where the 40 acres and a mule come from. This is where reparations, the reparations debate come from. He actually did, most people don't understand this, but he actually did give his people that were under his command those 40 acres and a mule. But if you remember history, Abe Lincoln didn't live very much long after the Civil War was over, and his successor was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a former slave owner, but he was very interesting because Andrew Johnson was a slave owner who didn't like the big slave owners. He didn't like the big plantations. He only liked, he was a part of the middle class, I would say, slave owners, and when it comes to slave owners. But he then went back and issued special pardons once he became president, and he pardoned a lot of those. History would be so different had Lincoln still lived, and had Andrew Johnson not pardoned all those former Confederates. But he wound up pardoning a bunch of the former Confederates and gave them their property back. So although those blacks in that area, see, make sure you understand this, for reparations and 40 acres and a mule was never meant for all former slaves. It was only meant for the slaves who were under the leadership or under the guidance of General Sherman, because he had the right to do that at that time. Well, when Johnson came in office and pardoned those guys and gave them their property back, they had to give those former slaves, had to give those former Confederates their property back. But there was a major question, and if you remember the letter of secession, Mississippi letter of secession, they said, "You all are trying to change the plight of these slaves, and you're not, and you're doing so without giving them a better situation." So there was a major question, and the question was simply, what shall we do with the Negro? And I'm asking you that question. What do you think they should have done with the Negro at that time period? Slavery just, ended. The Civil War was the bloodiest war in the history of America. Brother on brother, uncle against uncle. Slaves fought on both sides of the war. It was bloody. What should they do with the Negro? What was the position? What do you think? Before he passed, Lincoln had an idea. In most of our history books, we look at Lincoln as, we were taught, and I was taught, that Lincoln was such a mythical figure. He was such a great man, one of the greatest presidents, and he really was for the plight of African Americans. But the truth of the matter is, Lincoln wasn't as glamorous as he was, as he's portrayed, I should say. He actually placed a higher priority on rebuilding the Union than he did on emancipation. As a matter of fact, when Lincoln delivered his famous Emancipation Proclamation, it was very careful how he did that. he only freed slaves in the states that were in rebellion. There were slaves in other states that didn't rebel. Lincoln purposely did not free all the slaves. And it was a very tactical move. I'll tell you why. He didn't free all the slaves. See, Virginia, if you know where D.C. is located, I wish I had a map right here. I can show you all. When I become a better online instructor, I have a map here and I'll show you all. But if you know where D.C. is located, to the south of D.C., you have Virginia. To the west and northern part of D.C., you have Maryland. Where Maryland was a slave-only state. They had slaves in Maryland, but it was they didn't succeed. Virginia did. Lincoln purposely didn't free all the slaves because he didn't want Maryland to secede from the Union as well. Had Maryland and Virginia both seceded from the Union, the capital of D.C. would have been surrounded by slave-owning states. He didn't want the capital to be surrounded by Confederate states. So he purposely only freed the slaves in the states that were in rebellion. A little piece of history. But he actually showed an enduring respect for states' rights. And he offered major incentives to white Southerners at the expense and the interest of African Americans, of blacks. But we went through a period called Reconstruction. What did Reconstruction entail? Of course, Lincoln died, and then he died. I think it was like 3 days into his second term or something like that. So Andrew Johnson became president, and there was a big debate, and Congress had to go through him, and this was a former slave owner. The first part of the Reconstruction Act, it created 5 military districts. So these military generals came down and they broke the South up into 5 districts. And that's how they controlled the South. And any new state that wanted to come back in, Congress had to approve it. It gave voting rights to all men. We're going to go through those in just a second. And all states that wanted to come back into the Union at this time during the Reconstruction Act, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. We're going to go through those amendments, those Reconstruction Amendments. Now, 3 key amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. When was slavery abolished? Slavery was not abolished with the Emancipation Proclamation. Why? We just discussed that. Lincoln purposely didn't want to abolish slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment granted the right to vote to men. Which amendment granted the right to vote to women? In what year? It's the 18th Amendment. It's the 18th Amendment of 1920. Well, during this period called Reconstruction, this is a chart I put up here for you. During this period, these are African Americans in Congress. Of course, all the Southerners who were in Congress before, the Civil War, they gave up their seats. And so when they gave up their seats, they were no longer members of America. They seceded from the Union. So these seats were then vacated by, a lot of these seats were vacated by African Americans. So you can see the first state to put a African American senator in the U.S. Senate was Mississippi. You see right here. It was Mississippi. But as you can see this line here, there are a bunch of African Americans in the state legislators. There were 2 U.S. senators, both from Mississippi, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, and then U.S. Congressman. And then I think our U.S. Congressman from Mississippi was John R. Lynch. But during Reconstruction, African Americans were in Congress, and they, it was thought that these former slaves and these former African Americans, when given the opportunity, they wouldn't know how to run a government. They wouldn't know how to do anything that was productive. In regards to running this country. But when given the opportunity, let's look at some of the things they did when given the opportunity to serve in those capacities. Well, the first and I think the most important thing that came as a result of Reconstruction is public education. Before the Civil War, I'll use Mississippi for example. Of course, you all can tell I'm a Mississippian. Before the Civil War, only 13% of the white population in Mississippi were educated. 13% of the white population, not the entire population, but 13% of the white population were educated. Which means 87% of the whites weren't even educated. So only the elite, only the plantation owners, only the elite were being educated. Their children were being educated. During Reconstruction, when these African Americans and these liberals and Northerners were in office, and there were no Southerners to block these things, they established public education, comprehensive education for all children. Very important, because education in America, education is the one thing that separates America from any of its other, any of the countries before that preceded America, these great superpowers. And I think, in my opinion, public education in America is probably the most important reason that America became a superpower as soon as she did. And we can go in that debate and talk later, but just keep that in mind, because education in America, public education in America, has set America apart from her counterparts throughout history. This is when America said, what we want to do, we want to educate all of our children. By educating all of your children, what you're doing is you're creating a huge middle class. In other countries, in other previous civilizations, you had this small upper class, middle, a little bit larger middle class. It's probably like the military people, and a huge lower class. This was everyone else, and there was no way to jump classes. Well, in America with public education, what we said, of course, every civilization has always had a small upper class. But instead of having a huge lower class, public education allowed us to have a huge middle class. And that's why America is set up different than other countries. And that's why, in my opinion, I believe America has survived as the youngest, probably superpower in the history of civilization on Earth, because of our public education system. And it came as a result of the Reconstruction, when those African Americans and those liberal whites were in office, and those Southerners couldn't come in and block public education for everyone. Also, during this time period, they instituted these historically black colleges and universities, and here are a few of the ones that were established during Reconstruction. As a matter of fact, Howard, which is probably the most prominent of the historically black colleges and universities, was named after General Oliver O. Howard. He was actually a white Union officer, Union general, and they named Howard University after that general. Piece of history. But the worst thing that happened to African Americans, and I could go in depth on during Reconstruction of all the things and all the accomplishments of Reconstruction, but I didn't want to do that because it's not important to what I want you all to understand for this course. But the worst thing to happen to African Americans was the Compromise of 1877. Let's discuss it. It did a few key things, and I'll give you the background behind the compromise. As a result of the disputed election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden was a Democrat. At this time in history, the Democrats were the party of the South. They were the Southerners. They were the the ones who were pro-slavery. The Republican was the party of Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican. Yeah, they were kind of they were different, and there was a disputed election, and so behind closed doors, they came together and said, "I tell you what, Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden, and his guys, and the Democrats said, I tell you what, we'll give you all the presidency, but you have to do one thing for us, one important thing for us. You have to agree to this compromise. It's the Compromise of 1877. And the most important part of this compromise was the removal of the federal troops. When they removed those federal troops from the South, haywire broke out. And all those angry former Confederates, they came, and, this is when lynching went rampant. There was more than 3,500 lynchings between 1865 and 1965. There were more than 500 of those documented lynchings in the state of Mississippi alone. They were angry, they were embarrassed, and their way of lashing out at society, at the government, at anyone, was to simply annihilate and to, simply demolish any African American they saw fit. We're not going to go in depth, but I could tell you some lynching stories. I've done a lot of research on that. They were demoralizing, and they were simply a backlash of the Civil War. A backlash of America telling them, we're going to take your money, we're going to take your property, we're going to take everything that you all thought was yours in regards to slavery, and you no longer have access to it. It was a backlash of telling Mississippians, we're going to take you from being the richest state in the nation to being a welfare state. And these are a few other things that the compromise encompassed. But during this time period, you had the KKK. It's just talking about lynching. This slide talks about lynching, and you can pause it and go through this if you want to, but it's not as important. I just wanted to include this slide in here. But post-Reconstruction, once the troops were withdrawn, the South began passing these Jim Crow laws and laws that regulated race relations. And these are the laws that prohibited blacks from using the same public accommodations as their white counterparts. And this was the law of the land. And there was a Jim Crow law that said you couldn't sit in the same cell if you were in prison. There was a Jim Crow law that said you couldn't drink from the same water fountain. There are laws and laws and laws that began passing. So this was after the Compromise of 1877. So there was this guy named Homer Plessy, and in 1892, Homer Plessy was 1/8 black. Very important. All of his characteristics, physical characteristics, when you look at him, everything about him looked as though he was a normal white male. As a matter of fact, I don't mind if you all pause the video right here and Google Homer Plessy to see what I'm talking about if you need a visual representation. Well, Homer Plessy, everyone in the town knew that Homer Plessy was only 1/8 black. He had 1/8. I think that means his great-grandfather, I believe, was probably a black person, or grandmother, I don't know. But Homer Plessy purposely went in and sat in the wrong cart, the rail cart, on the train in Louisiana somewhere. And of course he was arrested. But see, you say, well, Aaron, what's wrong with simply sitting in different carts? It's just, you sit in that cart, I sit in this cart. Well, let me explain the difference in the different carts. At that point, the blacks and the smokers would sit in the cart right behind, in the first cart. The wealthier you were, the further back you sat in the cart. Why is that important? Well, there's smoke and the smog from the engine in the first cart, and the engine cart will come right down the people who sit in the front. So you're constantly breathing in the smoke and the smog from those coal engines. And the smokers, they were put up there because they, I guess they were used to the smoke and smog. But more importantly, you would get off these carts and you have, your clothes were no longer white. They were no longer clean. They were dirty. They were, you were stinking. So it was very demoralizing to sit in that front cart. So Homer Plessy, being 1/8 black, he went and sat in one of the rear carts with the whites. He was arrested, and eventually we had the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The United States Supreme Court said in 1896 that we can have separate accommodations as long as they're equal. And separate but equal became the law of the land for the United States starting in 1896.